In Mark chapter 8, we're talking about the feeding of 4,000. Going to begin in verse 1 through verse 10. It says, "In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their own houses, they will faint on the way, for some of them have come from afar." Then his disciples answered him, "How can we satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness?" He asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" And they said, 7. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, broke them and gave them to his disciples, and set them before them. And he set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftovers of fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them away. Immediately got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmatia. All right, this some have thought is the same as where we were in Mark chapter 6 with the reading of 5,000, because there's some similarities. However, that's just not the case. Remember, we have been following Jesus, and last week we had a little PowerPoint, and I took you through the maps, how Jesus has gone from Galilee. He went up into Tyre and Sidon, and then came down into this area called Decapolis, where there are 10 cities. And there are a lot of Gentiles in these areas. It's one that's ruled by the Syrians. It's still in Israel proper, but this was an area where there were a lot of Gentiles. Jesus has been developing the apostles, those 12. He's spending extra time. And you remember how he took the 12 up into Tyre with a Syrophoenician woman who had a daughter that was demon-possessed. And he was speaking to the disciples when he said she has mega faith, and that's the word that he's used there. Such great faith, mega faith. And that was set against or contrasted with the leaders of Israel that had no faith in Christ. Many of the people of Galilee had seen Jesus. He's been there for so long, they've heard him. But the Gentiles in this area are not as familiar. Now, some of them may have seen Jesus. Some of them may have gone up into Galilee, into that other area. But for the most part, these Gentiles are kind of outside of the loop. And so, as we ended up in chapter 7 in verse 37, remember the man who was deaf and he was unable to speak or to speak clearly. And so these people are astonished at what Jesus was doing, at the way he could heal. As a matter of fact, they said that, remember 11, just look, because he says he has done all things well. In other words, it was amazing. It was beyond their understanding. There may have been faith healers, or there may have been healers around and whatever, but no one was able to do like Jesus. In all of that, by their saying, he has done all things well, it's moved from just being amazed to really worship, to really an adoration. They're giving to the God of Israel, they're giving praise. And so in some cases, it may have even meant some of those people trusted Christ. I just have to believe that some of them may have had a saving faith. So Jesus is moving through these Gentile areas. In doing that, we're going to see a great result. Now remember, and I've talked about this over the last few weeks, it was that demoniac that he sent back into this area, Decapolis, into the area of the 10 cities. And so it may have been that man that was the first commissioned missionary to go back, because so many people knew him, were afraid of him. They were just amazed to see that here is the one that made this man right, that healed him, that cast out that great legion of demons. So these cities have both Jew and Gentile, and these Gentile parts of the city would have been filled with all kinds of idols, idol temples, and idol worship. Mark in chapter 8 is about to present a whole series that parallels chapter 6 and parts of chapter 7. Just like this feeding of 4,000 parallels the feeding of 5,000. Sometimes people want to say, well, see, the Bible isn't accurate, the Bible's not true, because these are such similar, but they are two separate events. And sometimes they want to say, look, this was all speaking about one event, therefore the Bible's not accurate. But that's not the case. Whole different group of people. Before it was in Galilee, now we're in Decapolis. Jesus is working to prepare the 12 for a great work with the Great Commission, in sending out and being able to really go into this world to make an impact. And so now in both of these narrative cycles, these feeding, it's going to play a very important role on the disciples. Now another large crowd has gathered. As I said, Jew and Gentile. That's where it says, in those days, in the days when he had healed the deaf mute, in those days when he had been doing all this other healing among the Gentiles, a large crowd comes. And after listening to Jesus for 3 days, they have nothing to eat. They were probably weakened by hunger. And so that Jesus could have sent them away hungry, but he says that they would have collapsed on the way. Believe me, Jesus knew. Now, remember with the feeding of 5,000, the disciples come, and in chapter 6, verse 35 and 36, they said, send them away that they can go to the nearby towns and buy something to eat. But that's not the case here. Jesus, it says in verse 2, I have compassion on the multitude. So Jesus had compassion on them because of their physical need, and he calls the disciples' attention to this. He takes the initiative to feed this multitude in order to really recognize this. Mark's usage of this word of compassion is different from the way it's ever been used before. It's now first person singular. I have compassion. Do you see how it's translated in your Bibles? I have compassion. That's a statement there, and it's the only place in all of the 4 Gospels that Jesus ever says this. I feel compassion is what he's saying. There are many other times when Jesus said, having compassion, and it's third person. But now we're seeing something about the character of our God, the character of our Lord. We're seeing something that God, in the person of Jesus, he understands who we are in our humanity. He observes us, he knows that, and he's moved by it. It's an interesting word. The root word means the inner organs. The root word means it's kind of the heart. It's the stomach where you feel emotions. And that's what it's talking about, the feelings of emotion, wherever the sympathy and the affection comes from, where pity and kindness and compassion. That's the word that's used here. It's out of my innermost parts that I feel that. And so the Lord is declaring And by the way, this is an attribute that God possesses. Compassion is an attribute of God. I think that that's an interesting thing. Because it's interesting when you compare our God, when we look at the characteristics of God, the true God. Other religions of the world have a very different God. The Muslims' God, for example, sometimes chooses to do evil to different people because he's not having a good day. And so that's the way the Muslims will say, you know, why is it that good things happen to some people and bad things happen to some people? They'll say God just isn't having a good day. That's not our God. That's not the God of the Bible. They also believe in jinn. Now, you've heard of genies, but have you heard of jinn? Jinn are little demons. And their God has created all these little demons, and their purpose is evil. Their purpose is to go out and, you know what? When you can't find your glasses, it was the jinn. Wait a minute, I know I left them on that table. Well, some little evil jinn has taken your glasses and hidden them and moved them somewhere else. Well, did God do that? Did God prepare? Is that our God? What about the Hindu gods? The Hindu gods, if you do not appease their gods with some kind of a sacrifice, they're out to get you. There's going to be retribution. I just say this because our God, the God of the Bible, the Christian God, I believe the true God, is a God that's very much different from worldly religion's God. He's not out to get us. He's a God of compassion. He's a God who cares. These people have come a long way. They've been sleeping on the ground and they haven't eaten. And why? Why haven't they eaten? There's such interest in who this Jesus is because they've known this man who is demon possessed, and now he's in his right mind and he's telling everybody about this Jesus that cast out the demons. And now they have seen what Jesus could do by healing of the deaf mute. And there were so many other miracles that Jesus did. They were amazed and they do not want to go anywhere. So they put hunger aside. By the way, we know that some of Decapolis came and they'd seen these miracles, and it's so stunning and so staggering. They're watching all of these healings and everything and all of these disabilities. They've never seen anything or heard anything like the teaching of Jesus or seen what he's doing, so they don't go anywhere. They're overwhelmed by what's going on. That's how we left verse 7 or chapter 7. They said he does all things well. And so in verse 3 it says, if I send them away hungry to their homes, they'll faint on the way. Isn't that what he's telling them? It's a vivid word. It means they're going to collapse. It's literally the word, well, of an unstrung bow. Now, nowadays, people that do archery have compound bows. But when I was a kid, you just had a recurve bow, and you had to get that loop on there and stretch tight that bowstring to get it to work. Well, the idea is that thing has come apart. And that's what it is. Like an unstringed bow, it just falls apart. Everything, maybe even to one end. That drew Jesus's compassion. He knew exactly. So this is a general kindness and compassion that the heart of our God, there is no parallel to it in any other religion of the world. This is the true God, the God of compassion. Verses 4 and 5, then it says, then his disciples answered him, how can one satisfy these people with bread here in the wilderness? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. Let's stop right there. The disciples question Are they slow learners? Are they just a little bit hard to learn? They've already seen Jesus feed the 5,000 men, heads of household. By the way, we're going to see that that's what this is also. These are 4,000 head of household. We'll talk about that. Here, Jesus is presenting them with a very new crisis. Because remember, these are going to be men that will head up the Lord's churches. These are men that are going to lead out and be foundational. And so this shows kind of indirectly they are not ready. So they're asking, they know they can't meet the need. They know they don't have within them. And it's important to remember that back there on the seashore of Galilee, they were near the town of Bethsaida, but now they're far out. There's just nowhere they could go and buy that food. And so it's a remarkable demonstration of the compassion here, that even though people can live more than 3 days without food, they needed this tender mercy, the compassion of our God, that he knew that they had to have this bodily. By the way, let me just say, I'm going to kind of paraphrase or go a different direction. Jesus has compassion on anybody, on everybody. Initially, that was to the Jews. In Galilee, those were all Jews. Now, probably the majority of these are Gentiles. Now these are Jews and Gentiles, this lingering crowd, lingering for 3 days. They've been sleeping on the ground. There's no large city around. The cities of Decapolis are scattered far apart, and it's summertime now. They're sitting on the ground, and the grass would have died. This is barren land. As a matter of fact, that's what the word says when it says that they were in a desolate place. Wilderness, your version might say. It's a desolate place. It's Arapmius, and that's the Greek word for a desert. Maybe that's the way yours is translated. How are we going to satisfy this many people with bread here in this desert or deserted land or empty place, desolate place? I really believe that Jesus is asking kind of a rhetorical question. I think it assumes they have not forgotten the previous feeding. Would they have forgotten that? I don't think so. But I think it's more of a prompting of the Lord asking, what are you going to do? It's not that they doubt his power, but these are Gentiles. What are you going to do, Lord, for these Gentiles? These are not Jews. They're really coming back and saying, Lord, we're not really sure how to go about this. We're not sure how to go forward. And it was beyond them the last time, and that time, of course, the Lord just produced all the food. And they're really coming back saying, this is beyond us again. In this desolate place, how are we going to satisfy this people? What in the world are they asking for? Many months ago, there were probably as many as 20,000 people fed. Here we have 4,000, and Matthew 15 and verse 38, it says, besides women and children. So maybe you've got 4,000 heads of household. You may have 15,000 people here. How are we going to take care of that? What are we going to do with this? Where will anybody be able to find enough bread in this desolate, deserted place to satisfy all these people? So Jesus' question is concerning the amount of bread that's available. Clearly, they know his intentions. This is an invitation really for the disciples to use the resources that they have. 7 loaves. And then later on, we're going to see a few small fish. So that takes us to verse 6 and 7. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks. He broke them and gave them to his disciples and set them before them. And he set them before the multitude. They also had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said to set them also before them. So this feeding of this crowd, like it was with the 5,000, but it's not the same. This Greek participle that's translated, that he has taken and he has given thanks. It's a word that we get our word Eucharist from, Eucharistus, thanks to God. He broke it, and it is in the aorist tense, which all of that means that he broke it and he kept on breaking, kept on giving it. So this is very, very much a verb that's what they call an imperfect verb. In other words, he starts doing it and it doesn't end. It just keeps going. He's giving this bread to the disciples for the distribution, the very same with this few small fish. He's breaking it, giving it, putting it more in the baskets. It's just coming and going more and more and more and more. That's the idea of it. So with verse 7, they also had a few small fish. And remember last time they found a little boy who had 5 loaves and 2 fish. And here they manage 7 loaves and a few small fish. That's nothing to a massive crowd. 5 loaves, 7 loaves, few small fish, 15,000 people possibly. The disciples are not as skeptical here like they were last time. I think they just want to wait and see what's going to happen. They know that Jesus has the power to do this. They know, and they're going to learn his compassion toward Gentiles. And I really think that that's what their question is. Lord, are you going to help these people? They're not Jews. Are you going to help these people? These people, remember, they've been trained to despise them. These are people that are outside of the covenant. These are people that are not in Judaism. They're idol worshipers. Are you going to have compassion on them? You see, that's a critical issue that Jesus is bringing the 12 to confront. That's what he's doing. And in verse 8 and 9, he brings that to them. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets of leftover fragments. Now those who had eaten were about 4,000, and he sent them, or about 4,000, and he sent them away. We're going to stop right there. So in this abrupt fashion, Mark stressed that it's sufficient for everyone. This miracle, everyone ate and is satisfied. This is a whole abundance of provision. Because what do? They take up 7 basketfuls of food that's remaining. 7 baskets. Now, remember we talked about, and I brought a little thing before, the Jewish basket was something kind of like a lunch bag. That's something that you could carry around, and you had just that much room. We're now talking about something the Gentiles had, more like a chest. As a matter of fact, do you remember in the book of Acts when they let Paul down in a basket on the wall because they were out to kill Paul? That's the same word. That's the kind of basket that they have here. And so this is a huge amount of food that's left over. And he takes all these loaves and he takes these fishes. Everyone is satisfied. It means that they ate to their fill. Why did they use, and why is it that Mark uses that word? Because that's the word that they used in the feeding of 5,000 before, and it meant that they were filled up to where you could not eat another bite. Everybody got all that they want. Now imagine people have been hungry for 3 days. Nothing to eat. Whatever, or maybe they had a little something themselves. But now they're satisfied. They understand that if anything's going to happen, when it happens with the Lord, it happens maximum. He does it all of the way. The Lord feeds to the full. So they're simply saying, Lord, if it's going to happen, we're not going to be able to do it. This isn't coming from us. We don't have the resources. We don't know how to do this. But they're learning that the gospel was going to go to the extent to the Gentiles and to the ends of the earth. That's the Great Commission. So Jesus kept filling the baskets, passing them, and that's why it says that they ate and they were filled, or they were satisfied. And when the disciples went to pick up what was left over, and they knew what to do, by the way. Remember, they've done this before. So the disciples are waiters. They're out there passing out the food, but now they know when nobody else can take any more, all right, the leftover broken pieces, they pick it up. And it's an interesting statement because they automatically knew this before they're being told. And none of this is going to go to waste. This is a meal for today and won't survive for later. 7 large baskets were left over of these broken pieces and the remaining fish. And as I said, these are not small baskets, but these are like a chest, like a big woven chest that was used. So Jesus dismisses the crowd, and immediately it says there that in verse 9, it says that he sent them away, immediately got into the boat. Now, we've talked about the boat a number of times, so this is the same boat that they keep using. It probably belongs to Peter or John, or maybe Zebedee, John and James' father. But it's the one that was there waiting for the Lord. Immediately they got into the boat with his disciples and came to the region of Dalmanutha. So he sent them away. The 3 days are over. Immediately he's sending them back. Now, Dalmanutha was back on that northwest corner, kind of near Capernaum. He's going back up to the area of Galilee. So they were southeast, and they're going to take now this boat and go diagonally across the whole lake to get to this area of Dalmanutha. Now Matthew calls it Magdala. This is where Mary of Magdalene has come from. Magdalene is not her last name. Mary of Magdalene. It's also in this same area where Dalmanutha is. It's interesting because archaeologists have now discovered in the Sea of Galilee there was a little harbor, and it has now been submerged, that is right between Magdala and Capernaum. So even though Matthew says that they were going to Magdala, and Mark says they're going to Dalmanutha, it's basically the same place. And now, because this little harbor that would have been right there, that led in this area of Capernaum, that led to Magdala or Magdalene, that's the place. So there was this little fishing stop. This was the port. This was the pier right along that area. So this region is known as the very same. I said that because some people want to say, see, the Bible is wrong. Mark says this, Matthew says that. No, we're talking about the very same place. And this is good. It's a good point here to understand this ends the Gentile experience. Now Jesus is bringing this whole experience of the Gentiles that went from the healing of the demoniac, the healing of that woman, the Syrophoenician woman who had a daughter that was demon-possessed, this deaf man, all of the many miracles, he's closing that out. He's coming back to Galilee. Things are really about to change, and that's what we see, a very big transition in chapter 8. But we could ask, what did the disciples learn in this? What is Jesus trying to teach them? And I think the very first lesson is who Jesus is. They need to know this is the very Son of God. This is the divine person. the divine person of Christ. It's indicated by his divine power. They're getting a lesson in what, if we were in a seminary class, Christology, where they're learning about who Christ is, that Jesus is God. In John 14, Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Remember over in the Gospel of John in chapter 10, that's what the Jews said. You make yourself God. We have Abraham as our father, but you make yourself God. They understood it. He was declaring himself to be the very God. So that was the first great lesson. He's the creator. He's the Word. Without him, nothing was made that was made. So the disciples and these apostles have to know that God is in human flesh because they've already seen. Remember, he had power over the waves. He stilled the storm, and they were in awe. The waves listened to him. The storm, the wind, they could not even imagine. The demons had to flee from him. They had to obey his word. What about him raising Jairus' daughter? Death. He had power over death. Nature. Creating food. Stopping the winds. Walking on water. All of these are evidences, and there's more. We've gone through them all through this part of Mark, showing who Jesus is. They had to learn also where true healing comes from. There were false healers. We have fake healers today. There's always going to be, as long as we have people that are sick, people that get desperate, there's going to be charlatans out there. But Jesus was able to heal people like they'd never seen. Remember people that, didn't have an eye, and all of a sudden there's an eye. The limb had been severed, no arm, and there's an arm. Whatever it was, all of those words, and by the way, the gospel says that if they were maimed, it used the word kulos. It meant that they were mutilated. That part of life where they'd lost a limb, they'd lost an arm or a leg. And the ability to give a limb, a leg, fully functional. His healing is real, and it's showing who he is, that he has the power to create. He is the God of eternity, where everything that he does is perfect. Last thing, they learned who Jesus was to worship him. They began to understand this is a divine person. They learned about healing. They learned also about who Christ was, and therefore he deserved their worship. The purpose in everything that was done was that we would worship God. Doesn't John tell us that? Remember, John is here. He's a part of this. The Father seeks true worshipers to worship him in spirit and in truth. The Gentiles got it. The Gentiles understood this, and they glorified God. What about Israel? Israel clamors for his death. Crucify him, crucify him. But in the end, every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. The Jews resent Jesus. The leaders of Israel despise him. They want him dead. The Gentiles glorify him. They recognize there's no one else anywhere like him.